moment today are really a long-term approach to reducing cancer mortality. And if you look at the role in curing cancer and prolonging life and or quality of life in the advanced setting, and you look at anti-cancer drugs today, the total impact they have is around 15%. This sort of analysis has been done. It is possible to unpick the relative contributions of the different modalities. That, of course, has dramatically increased from 20, 30 years ago when the estimates in the old days of classic chemotherapy was about 4 to 5%. But nevertheless, 85% of our control and cure still resides with other modalities. And if you look at data from reasonably socialized countries where there's no economic incentive to use one modality over another, and you look at surgery, radiotherapy alone, or combined without chemotherapy as treatment modalities, we're looking at around 80% of patients. And this is data from the UK NHS. And I guess from the argument I want to make primarily here is that from a population level, not an individual level, from a population level, anti-cancer drugs are absolutely important, but they are not the primary modalities of control and cure. And really, if we look at figures today in low and middle income countries, their relative contribution to outcomes drops down to about 3 to 4%, even with the modern chemotherapy drugs, for a whole slew of reasons around healthcare delivery. Let me move on to, is basic bioscience research too strongly focused on supporting therapeutic strategies? And to give you a little bit of context a moment, if you look between 2015 and 19, in the UK, there were 44 new cancer therapies for cancer were approved. It's absolutely extraordinary. We've seen no other period when we've seen that many get marketing authorizations. We're talking about 18 kinase inhibitors, nearly 16 monoclonal antibodies. And the duration of treatment now for biopharmaceuticals is around 318 days. That's the average amount of treatment time for patients. The costs have also dramatically escalated. Systemic anti-cancer therapy back in the early 2000s per patient in the UK was around 8,000. We're now talking about 62,000 per patient. So the number of new agents getting into the system has increased, the cost has increased. But the good question, I guess, around this is whether or not these are delivering clinically meaningful benefit. And you'll be aware that there have been a number of scales that have been developed: European Society of Medical Oncology, the German Joint Federal Committee scale, ASCO scale, to look at whether a lot of these cancer drugs are actually delivering clinically meaningful benefit. And this has all been published in the clinical literature. And if you look at what we have currently that has marketing authorizations in the UK and through the EMA, between about 67 and 75, depending on which scale you use, of the cancer drugs that are in the marketplace do not deliver clinically meaningful benefit. So before we even get to the price discussion here, we have a real imbalance. And there's a marvelous paper that Nathan Cherney wrote on immuno-oncology drugs. I mean, a fabulous piece of work was published in Nature, where he looked at the 9 immuno-oncology drugs and the 28 indications, and the 68 indications, and again made this assessment about whether they were delivering true clinically meaningful benefit. And 60% of those immuno-oncology drugs in their indications were not delivering clinically meaningful benefit. So we have a problem here with the ecosystem as a whole. We've got a huge amount of pressure, a lot of political heat, a lot of money driving biopharmaceuticals, and it's driving an awful lot of these pharmaceuticals into the marketplace with greater uncertainty, higher costs, and making it harder and harder for policymakers to actually balance this against investments in surgery and radiotherapy. And then finally, within this section, I just want to talk about the R&D landscape as well. And this is what we've done and many others have done, looking at how the R&D landscape has changed over the last 20, 25 years. And we use something called scientometrics. It assesses and analyzes research publications. And when you look at this, what you see now is between 75 and 80% of all R&D is discovery science underpinning biopharmaceuticals, direct biopharmaceutical research, or biomarker research associated with that. And that is essentially compressing research funding and research into all these other domains that we need in order to prove outcomes. And what's interesting, and I would suggest slightly worrying, is that a lot of the public funders are aligning their money and their activities under the general biopharmaceuticals R&D. So the imbalance I want to suggest here is quite severe. So the R&D movement has been entirely into biopharmaceuticals at the expense of many, many other areas that need funding and supporting. And finally, of course, part of the proposition is that we need to balance this out with prevention and early detection. I absolutely admit that, in terms of chemo prevention, for secondary prevention, there's a role there for the biopharmaceutical industry. But when it comes to prevention of obesity, tobacco, etc., we're really talking here about power and politics and about research domains around economics, social realms around behavioral sciences. There is a trade-off here. If you put money in one place, there's a cost opportunity of not supporting other forms of research or endeavors. In the early detection space as well, of course, bioscience is having an increasing role. We've already had meetings talking about multi-cancer early detection tests like Gallery, polygenic risk scores in primary care. I suspect they will have a place in the future, but prime time is not here yet. And if you want to be super promiscuous, we can start talking about the role of medtech and artificial intelligence for syndromic surveillance. And again, there are potential roles there, but I think substantially, when we're talking about prevention early detection, we really are talking about politics, social determinants, the organization and structure of healthcare systems, behavioral and social sciences. And the argument I want to make here is there is a limited pot of R&D funding. What goes into biopharmaceuticals is cost opportunity when it could be funding other areas in terms of healthcare policy, health systems research, behavioral sciences, palliative care, research into surgery and radiotherapy. So I'm going to finish by saying, yes, absolutely. Biopharmaceutical industry is in a critical role of drugs in treating many of our patients. But as it stands at the moment, my contention is the system from an R&D perspective, from political and economic perspective, is wildly unbalanced. And I'll stop there, Ian, and pass back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Steve, what would you please introduce yourself and then perhaps respond to what Richard has said?
Oh, I will do. Can people see those slides? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm Steve Wedge. I worked on cancer therapeutics for over 30 years in industry. And now for charity. So I work with Cancer Research UK, which has a translational arm called Cancer Research Horizons. So obviously we work on therapeutics, but I just wanted to outline that clearly this is only a small part of what CRUK does and the strategy that it has. Its objectives do cover discovery of new pathways and fundamental mechanisms of cancer. They have a strong evolving strategy against prevention, detection, and then treatment as well. And if anybody's interested in those, they do have roadmaps for these available on their website. So from my perspective, it's not that all cancer bioscience is focused against therapeutics. But for the purposes of this, I guess what we could say is on the right-hand side here, we're talking about late-stage disease, and that is complicated. No doubt it's complicated. It's averted immune surveillance mechanisms. It's got great heterogeneity in terms of its cellular molecular biology. And as we know, actually, the translation of preclinical to clinical is complicated in the model systems that we have. We've probably learned an awful lot, though, from putting therapies into patients and about the real disease biology. And I think we need to do more in that. We need more clinical and experimental endpoints to really interrogate what we are doing with clinical trials and to understand that in more depth, and potentially also advances in disease modeling as well, where we can actually sample and examine at a much greater depth responses to treatment. If we then work across this pathway, we go to early stage disease in the middle, then of course, if you intervene earlier, you're probably going to have a greater outcome. If you intervene at the earliest stage of lung cancer, then 6 in 10 survive for 5 years. If you do it at the later stage, less than 1 in 10 survive 5 years. So that makes complete sense. And we will have new methodologies, new ways of doing that, using AI, for example, for looking at detection methods, analyzing data methods, health records. There's an awful lot we can do in that space. But it needs those detection methods to be robust and reliable and not to give false positives. And of course, it doesn't mean that every type of disease or every type of cancer, that will be the end of it. There may be disseminated disease. We may need to develop neoadjuvant and adjuvant paradigms to deal with that. So this too could be a point of therapeutic intervention. And then we go across to the left-hand side. Clearly, if we could just prevent cancer, then that is what we should do. But probably the estimates is that maybe 40% of it we know at the moment is from modifiable risk factors like tobacco, obesity, and clearly not all of that can be prevented. So what we need to do with the rest of it is to really define those high-risk populations and work out what we can do. That may be new chemoprevention strategies. Again, maybe a point for therapeutic intervention. So I see this as a continuum, and undoubtedly we have to address the things in the middle and the left-hand side, and we need to do more on that. But I don't think we can forget about the right-hand side because of the numbers of patients and the scale of the problem that we currently have. As an example of an intervention trial, I'm based in Newcastle. I know Sir John Byrne, who did this trial. This is Lynch syndrome that has a defective DNA mismatch repair. These patients have colorectal cancer or prone to colorectal cancer, and then other cancers, in particular endometrial. And because of epidemiological information on aspirin use, they did this double-blind trial, giving aspirin for 2 years. And they monitored it for 10 years, up to 20 years in a cohort of patients in a trial which involved 43 international sites. And as you can see, 40 out of 427 participants developed colorectal cancer when they had aspirin, but 58 in those who received a placebo. So this is a definite success. This is the kind of thing we can do. Interestingly, in those non-colorectal cancers, there was no effect. So if you had Lynch syndrome, definitely worth thinking about taking aspirin for 2 years. The issue is when you look at this, and this is a really good example, and it's got a really well-characterized genetic susceptibility. You've got a single therapy that's really well tolerated. It requires quite long studies, a long time to give those definitive results. We said multiple centers to do it with this patient cohort. Readouts, you would get anything if you look at that graph from 5 years, you're probably looking at 10 years, maybe later to show that you're actually modifying the disease. And then if you look at the right-hand side, why did it work in 2 out of 3 patients? Just because it's a prevention trial and a positive prevention trial, we're not going to prevent all cancers. Why did it only work in colorectal and not endometrial? Who knows? Was the dose optimal? Was the schedule optimal? Probably not. We'd probably go back and do more trials even still, and that's ongoing. Do we even know how aspirin works? Whole range of things. And I think, just thinking about trying to do this and do this systematically, it's going to take a long time, and we're going to get patients with cancer. Within the timeline of 20 years, maybe 500 million patients with cancer. I think it is also, people can be dismissive about what therapeutics have achieved, but there are some real improvements. You talked about IO approaches. Well, pembrolizumab, came into stage 4 melanoma, and your median survival was 6 months before this, and now it's 6 years. And then by having that therapy, we can walk back into earlier and earlier disease, to look at neoadjuvant paradigms and to expand that out into other combinations, other settings, and to look at combinations with other therapies as well. So it gives opportunity, and it's easy to dismiss this, but we're learning about those types of disease where it does work and doesn't work, and we need to interrogate that doesn't work more. In terms of a good example of a combination, this is one with an ADC, antibody drug conjugate, which targets Nectin-4 in bladder cancer. This is locally advanced or metastatic bladder cancer. And it was compared head to head with chemotherapy, the best chemotherapy that is established in this disease. And the objective response rate has gone up from 44% to nearly 68%, median PFS almost doubled, and the overall survival, 31 months versus 16 months. And the assessment at that point was that there were about 12% of patients cured with chemotherapy, but about 30% with this molecular targeted treatment or combination treatment. And that was approved in December of last year. So if you get it right, this can make a real difference to patients beyond anything else that we have to offer them at the moment. Clearly also, if you have a well-tolerated therapy, you understand the patient selection, then you can walk things back from advanced disease even into prevention. Another example here is
Steve, you have had 8 minutes, so can you bring it to a close, please?
I've got one. Okay. As you can see on the left-hand side, advanced disease. On the right-hand side, it prevented 61% of tumor development in patients over the first 5 years. Again, didn't cure everybody. So finally, all I was going to say is that we do need to do the prevention and early intervention, but we don't need to forget about the therapeutic approaches. We need to understand advanced disease as well as earlier, think about repositioning, new combinations, sequencing of therapies. There's a whole host of technical innovation that might open up new drug space. And the earlier part, there are going to be challenges. And unfortunately, we won't prevent all cancers. And so this is about trying to meet that unmet need for patients to deliver more efficacious, better tolerated therapies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I guess we stop sharing the screen. Thank you, Steve. And we'll move on. Jack, let's hear your point of view next, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I put a slide up. Can people see it? So that saves people having to look at me, which is, again, one of the best things I'll do during my talk. So I'm not going to explain the slide right now. I'm going to start off with a quote, and this is a quote from Billy Sutton, not someone who's often quoted in the context of health policy because he was not a physician or an oncologist or a scientist. He was a bank robber. And he was asked why he robbed banks. And his reply was, because that's where the money is. And my background is in, amongst other things, drug and biotech investment. And I spent a lot of time sort of looking at the gritty realpolitik of why R&D funds flow where they do. And money isn't the only driving factor, but it's an important one. And in my talk, I'm really going to try and make 3 points. The first is that cancer drug R&D is much more heavily incentivized. Drug R&D in cancer is much more heavily incentivized than other forms of R&D in cancer, and indeed probably virtually any other forms of R&D in medicine. And that this is a matter of historical accident. It's not a matter of rational incentive design, right? Secondly, this heavy financial incentivization almost inevitably means that the marginal healthcare gain from the marginal dollar of cancer drug R&D investment is going to be low. And then the third point is that we're kind of locked into this pattern, and it's not simply a case of sort of evil drug companies. It's a complicated set of incentives, which mean lots of people involved in cancer provision are also tied into this system. And in some ways, just as Willie Sutton was robbing banks because there's a lot of money there, the actors in the cancer ecosystem are kind of locked into the behaviors that they exhibit by the financial incentives that the system provides. So why are the financial incentives for cancer so strong? Here, I think we Europeans have to show a bit of humility and recognize that our puny and stingy health systems do not spend enough on drugs to incentivize R&D. It's not true to say that the US is the only game in town, but the US, given its size and sort of lucrativeness of the market, is a huge cognitive magnet for commercial R&D investment, and commercial R&D investment dwarfs public sector R&D investment. And there's a peculiar set of conditions in the US that make cancer drugs particularly lucrative. First, there is both state and federal legislation that requires insurers to cover cancer drugs for pretty much all medically respectable uses to which they may be put. And that gives the sellers of cancer drugs almost infinite pricing power, which is limited, I would say, only by their embarrassability. And some of them are quite unembarrassable. And this kind of pricing doesn't apply to many other kinds of goods and services in healthcare. Secondly, the institutions that give cancer drugs to patients are effectively retailers with fixed markups. The buzzwords here are Medicare Part B and 340B hospitals. I won't bore you with what those are. But the general message is that the higher the cost of drugs that one of these institutions gives to a patient, the more money the institution itself makes, right? This is not the case with most other kinds of medical treatment. It's not the case with most other kinds of cancer goods and services. So, for example, if a hospital does cancer surgery and the surgery costs more, the hospital makes less money. And I'm going to quote you something here from an Institute of Medicine study from 2010, where a cancer physician said, I'll paraphrase actually, he said, look, if I spend 15 minutes with a patient and say they should have chemotherapy, they'll be quite happy because it sounds like I'm being aggressive. If I spend an hour with the patient explaining some complicated diagnostics which explain that chemotherapy probably isn't going to work, I get paid $220. In the former case, me and the institution make several $1,000s, right? So prescribing cancer drugs in the US healthcare context pays in a way that many other activities, including diagnostics and surgery don't. And this very strong incentivization has sucked a huge amount of R&D capital into oncology. So if I now turn to the slide, which I hope people can see, you'll see a very darkly colored vertical stripe. What this slide shows on the vertical axis are major drug companies. On the horizontal axis, we have lots of different therapy areas, and the color coding shows drug indication pairs in clinical development, right? So if you have one drug against one indication, that counts as one. If you've got 5 drugs against 5 indications, that counts as 25. What you see here is that AstraZeneca in cancer, this was, I think, in 2017, 2018, had over 200 drug indication pairs in cancer. And that's not that different from nearly every other big drug company, with the exception of Novo Nordisk, right? And roughly 40%, or possibly more than 40% of all candidates being currently tested in clinical development are cancer drugs, right? And possibly 40%, perhaps more, of all R&D expenditure at the moment goes on cancer because of this heavy incentivization. And coming to the sort of marginal value of the marginal R&D dollar, what this means is you get an awful lot of therapeutic, an awful lot of crowding. There was a lovely paper by Moser and Verdin, published, I think, in 2018, where they applied historical attrition rates to the known contents of drug pipelines. And they said, look, if we look at what's in the NHL non-Hodgkin lymphoma pipeline now, and we apply historical approval rates, we're going to have 30 new non-Hodgkin lymphoma drugs approved, and we're going to have 26 new non-small cell lung cancer drugs approved. Now, that's great for patients with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-small cell lung cancer, but it's pretty likely that the 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th new non-Hodgkin's lymphoma drugs are not going to have huge marginal efficacy over the previous 27 that are in the pipeline. Right? And again, we've seen this with the PD-1s and PD-L1s, right? Where it's absolutely true. Keytruda, Opdivo, nivolumab, pembrolizumab have been hugely successful drugs, but we've got tens of these compounds, right? With the later ones really adding very, very little marginal healthcare gain. The problem, I think, is that we're kind of locked into the current system. Again, this is not simply a problem of drug companies. The way much of the US healthcare system gets paid, and much of those providing US cancer care, they have come to rely on the margins they make effectively from reselling expensive cancer drugs. That's a problem. And they are very active in resisting reform. And then I think there's a second problem, which is to do with what's called evidence-based medicine. So evidence-based medicine has become very influential in determining how patients are treated. The economics of evidence generation are much more attractive for drugs than they are for many other kinds of intervention, right? It's cheaper to generate the evidence, and you make more money selling the thing that the evidence relates to than one does, for example, with diagnostics or preventive measures, right? So evidence-based medicine kind of supports this very strong incentivization that makes it difficult for innovation in other modalities. I think it's pretty tough to solve this.
Jack, your time is up, so please come to a conclusion.
And I'll say one thing. I think because we think Americans may be paying too much for the wrong kind of innovation, we should be careful what we wish for, because just if the Americans stopped paying too much for this particular kind of innovation, one shouldn't automatically assume that other people would start paying enough. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It's good that we're getting different points and different points of view. Very well. So Andrew, you're next. Please go ahead.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me. So my name's Andrew Reynolds. I worked for around 20 years in academic research. I joined AstraZeneca in oncology research and development about 7 years ago. And a lot of my recent research has been focused in on how we can bring medicines earlier in the tumorigenesis process, because this is where we feel they may have more benefit on outcomes. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak. And I'd then also like to just recognize, as I think many of the other speakers have said, the enormous progress the scientific community has made in the past few decades in terms of improving cancer survival rates. If you look at the US, for which arguably we have the best data, the 5-year overall survival rates for all cancers increased from 50% to 67% in the period 1970 to 2013. For example, outcomes for patients with prostate cancer and breast cancer have improved enormously. And I think it's important to recognize that the reasons for this are multifactorial and reflects improvements in both screening and early diagnosis, where we've made enormous gains, and improvements in the treatments we have available for cancer. And when I talk about treatments, of course, I include all of the modalities we have at our disposal. That includes improvements in surgery, radiotherapy, and certainly the availability of more effective and targeted medicines, although I think we can do better in terms of the medicines we have available. But there are several cancers for which 5-year survival rates still remain low, including diseases like pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, and esophageal cancer, where 5-year overall survival rates are still poor. Therefore, whilst I think we're moving in the right direction, I think we can all agree that we need to do better in terms of improving how we screen and detect cancer earlier, and in improving the treatments we have available. And it seems likely that medicines will continue to remain a component of how we get there. But I think we can have a greater impact on cancer mortality than we do now by focusing our research efforts in at least 3 areas. Firstly, in those post-diagnosis cancers, I think we do need to retain a focus on developing better medicines. In particular, we need better medicines for those cancers where outcomes are still poor, such as pancreatic cancer. And I think that will require a continued investment in research. But another area that I think, and we've heard about already, is more investment in earlier detection and treatment. We do desperately need to find and treat more early cancers. This means ensuring both equitable access to screening for the cancers where we already have effective screening technology, such as breast cancer and colorectal cancer. But it also means, I think, developing better technologies to detect those cancers that are currently very difficult to screen for and detect early, including pancreatic and ovarian cancer. And then finally, I think we should be thinking about trying to prevent cancer in those at highest risk. We need to have a better understanding of how cancer develops from normal tissues through pre-malignant phase into malignant disease, and that will open up opportunities to intercept or prevent cancer even before it develops. And I believe that medicines could have an important role to play in the earlier treatment and even prevention of cancer. So not just in the treatment of post-diagnosis cancers, but also for those earlier lines of therapy as well. And I think we've already seen success in that area, such as the HPV vaccines, which were developed to prevent cervical cancer, and already led to a massive impact on reduction in deaths of cervical cancer. And I think this is a really good example of how basic bioscience, the pharma industry, and governments worked together and got this right. The development of the understanding that HPV is linked to cervical cancer risk was a discovery made in basic bioscience. The pharma industry then invested in vaccine development and clinical trials, and governments all over the world have implemented vaccination programs and screening programs as part of their healthcare policy. And if you look at the totality of that, some projections predict that cervical cancer might actually be eradicated as the cause of death in this century, assuming equitable access, which we can obviously discuss. And I think that's an enormous achievement, demonstrating how bioscience, industry, and governments can work together to effect a really important change in the way we prevent cancer. So whilst I think it's a challenge now to imagine that we can create drugs to prevent all other forms of cancer, we can at least think seriously about the prospect of developing more medicines to treat cancer earlier and even to prevent cancer. And last year, we published a paper in Cancer Discovery called A View on Drug Development for Cancer Prevention, where we talked about this. And it was kind of a call to arms for all stakeholders, including the bioscience community, pharma, and healthcare policymakers, to work together to make further progress. In this paper, we argue for increased emphasis on identifying individuals at risk of cancer for whom cancer prevention measures could be targeted. For example, individuals at risk due to genetic predisposition, or those with a precancerous condition that's at risk of progression. We argue for increased emphasis on understanding how we prevent cancer in those individuals, which could include the development of medicines to reduce cancer risk. We argue for employing appropriate endpoints to measure the benefits of those interventions in a shorter time frame, and that's where we need to work closely with regulators. But we also recognize that none of this can be achieved in isolation, and that we need all relevant stakeholders to cooperate to create a healthcare system that's more focused on early intervention, which I think includes a role for medicines. So my day-to-day job is working on this. I'm pleased to say we're establishing a number of collaborations with academic groups to better understand the biology of pre-cancer and how we might bring medicines to high-risk individuals. And overall, it's my hope that by bringing effective medicines much earlier in the tumorigenesis process, we can have greater impact on reducing cancer morbidity and cancer mortality, but also that this is part of an integrated approach where we take all of the tools that are disposable, including surgery, radiotherapy, cancer prevention to improve outcomes. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Samra, it's your role to be the last speaker and bring things together. So welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm a medical oncologist treating melanoma and kidney cancer, and I run a research group focusing on cancer evolution and treatment resistance. And my fellow proposers, Richard and Jack, both had a quote, and I hadn't prepared one, but thinking of it, it might be Mick Jagger's "You can't always get what you want." Because I agree with the proposal that on the whole this is imbalanced, but I also want to argue that the approach to therapy development is a fairly major part of this issue and results in many opportunity costs. So Richard informed us earlier on how SACT contributes overall to improvements in cancer survival, and he did touch upon developments in immuno-oncology. And from an oncologist perspective, we can't ignore the significant improvements in overall survival with immune checkpoint blockade, and this is specifically in stage 4 disease. And we hadn't really seen this with SACT historically, with a few notable exceptions, germ cell tumors. Now, immune checkpoint blockade is also approved in the adjuvant setting for a number of indications, and this is also relevant. I think Steve had brought it up, that the window for early detection of some cancers will be narrow and some tumors will recur. So developments in the adjuvant and the adjuvant space are relevant. So overall, just to balance things, I do believe there will be an impact of developments in this particular therapy area and cure rates in all disease settings, and it will be significant. However, even if we take the best case scenario, that the poster child, and Steve brought it up, which is melanoma, in metastatic melanoma, where all comers are given combination immune checkpoint blockade, 50% of patients still do not benefit, and there is a serious risk of toxicity. In melanoma specifically, immune checkpoint blockade is now approved in the setting of high risk stage 2 disease, which is seen as a positive development, but this benefit is very modest. There is a 6% absolute risk reduction of developing distant metastases at 2 years. We don't have the overall survival benefit yet. And I want to emphasize the risk of toxicity because in these patients who are largely cured by surgery, it really has impact on quality of life because there are potentially life-limiting endocrine toxicities such as hypophysitis, adrenal insufficiency, and also insulin-dependent diabetes. So the costs to quality of life and also costs of drug acquisition and resource utilization are high. These are drugs that are given intravenously. There's a lot of chair time, and there is very little incentive to develop subcutaneous formulations and so on. So I would argue that given we have very few tools to apply these with precision and select patients, this is really where the proposal comes in, because there is lack of fundamental cancer biology understanding of the factors that drive disease relapse beyond clinical indicators. And a related issue that creates financial toxicity is the number of doses that need to be given for long-term responses. And these could be very few, but these de-escalation trials are difficult, and there is little interest in them from pharma. To Jack's point as well about Me Too drugs and focus on additional immune checkpoint blockade, since nivolumab and ipilimumab were approved, there haven't really been any other blockbusters in this area. So ongoing focus in the same space is probably going to have reduced returns. So what about this patient selection? Well, to be fair, pharma have embraced precision medicine to a degree, and now almost half of oncology trials do incorporate some sort of biomarker testing, compared to about 15% about 20 years ago. But with the exception of trials where the biomarker is the drug target, an example of that are the NTRK fusions. The biomarker studies are often one-dimensional. They fail to account for cancer complexity, for heterogeneity, both between patients and within tumors, as well as assay variants, thresholds. And good examples of this are, for example, tumor mutational burden cutoff. This is now a pan-cancer biomarker for all comers based on a study of 150 patients. The other one is PD-L1. I think one of the other speakers had brought it up. There are systemic biases in measurements of these. So these are all problematic. And when I say biomarkers, I really mean biology. I don't mean the use of biomarkers simply to stratify patients, but also to understand therapy failure. And a related problem is that pharma do fairly routinely create resources like this through collection of samples and sometimes quite extensive profiling. But this is not always rigorous or transparent. These insights are not always progressed forward, especially if they're around therapy failure. And the resources are not democratized such that academia can exploit them for patient benefit. There is also substantial barriers to cross-learning from trials from different sponsors, multimodal data integration, and especially learning from failure of drugs. And this really frustrates discovery science. So I'm speaking now from the perspective of basic scientists. And I guess there are anxieties about these sorts of exploratory studies when it comes to reductions in market share and so on. So my perspective is that there really needs to be a far greater emphasis in SACT trials on biologically rich clinical studies, such that we really glean the maximum amount of information that informs understanding from every patient, and move away from learning very little from many patients. And these patient-derived insights would probably provide a more fail-safe threshold for moving therapies forward to early phase testing compared to preclinical models in animals, for example, that account for cancer, that don't account for cancer complexity and heterogeneity. And furthermore, these sorts of data could provide basis for in silico trials, thus reducing the number of patients that need to be tested in formal clinical trials. So the idea of digital twins and deployment of AI to improve drug development. And lastly, I don't want to ignore the points that were made about cancer prevention and early diagnosis. Clearly, Richard has already elaborated on these being societal and political issues. And with the exception of liquid biopsy, there is very little incentive for innovation in cancer prevention. And I would also argue that there is a little intention to understand the biology of early disease in parallel to developing tests for early detection, which is ultimately what will be required in order to stratify patients for appropriate treatments and avoid dramatic overtreatment, which is one of the risks. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm in time in.
You are indeed in time, and thank you very much. So thank you to all the speakers. We have about 15 minutes, and for those of you who want to stay longer, we can take a little bit more to raise questions. So please, if you wish to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand and address either in general or to specific members of the panel. Okay, Peter Whitehouse, you have a question.
I'm a geriatric neurologist that works in the UK, the US, and Canada, and just attended the National Academy of Science meeting on research priorities in dementia. And watch out, cancer. That field has cancer envy, including the fact that with monoclonal antibodies administered IV in outpatients, the incentives that Jack so well described have driven the cancer field are going to drive the Alzheimer's field. And so I think comparisons across medical disciplines is perhaps interesting because there's many of the same issues, including the ethical issues. Two questions. One is, in our field, the lay organizations have a distorted perception of what priorities ought to be, and they're not really representing patients. And secondly, in my 50-year-old career, the FDA has suffered increasing regulatory capture. So what do you guys think about the role of lay organizations, and particularly because of the importance of the United States, the regulatory capture at the FDA? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And of course, obesity is another one that's going to challenge the cancer field. Who would like to address that? Richard?
Shall I go kick off? I guess directly to your point, there's some very good work now that's come out looking at, I guess, at how the biosciences, biopharmaceuticals industry has also captured a lot of the advocacy narrative. And it's been dramatically captured. And it's not to say, I don't want to tar all the patient advocacy groups with the same brush, because there's some excellent ones out there that have got a very balanced view of where innovation should be and what drives improvements and overall outcomes. But generally, when you look at the capture, I think the last piece of work I saw was a full-on 90% of them are captured, and we'll continue to push the same narrative around biomarkers, cancer drugs, and interestingly, most recently, of course, MSEDs as well, particularly with GRAIL. So we're seeing that sort of capture. The same, to be honest with you, has gone on with the regulatory authorities within Project Orbis. And again, we published extensively on this. We've seen substantial capture of regulatory authorities by the bioscience and biopharmaceutical industry, again, over the last 20 years. And this has been written on, frankly, ad nauseum from the social science perspective, from regulatory policy perspective. And Ian may want to say something around this, you know, the reduction in evidential requirements now to progress drugs through development and actually to put them onto the market. So as I said at the beginning, we're seeing more and more of these medicines getting marketing authorizations with greater and greater uncertainty about what their true efficacy is and or their toxicity and tolerability. And then in time, of course, what we discover is they're not really delivering what they say on the tin. And those two captures have gone hand in hand. And I would argue, and other people have argued from a social science perspective, that they've been part of a concerted effort of this fast to market paradigm. In other words, what patients want are faster and faster access to innovative new drugs. And maybe we can have a conversation. In my view, I think that's probably quite a dangerous paradigm from both a clinical perspective and also from a societal perspective in terms of being able to deliver affordable and sustainable care. And I'll stop there and hand over to someone else. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I have anything to add to what you've said. It's a very major problem. Other speakers, would you like to respond? Jack, Samra? No? We have other questions. Everybody is being shy. Let me raise one point then while people think of their questions about cancer prevention. Andrew, I think, mentioned anastrozole, or maybe it was Steve, and before it tamoxifen. We have drugs that have been shown to be quite effective in preventing certain types of cancer, in this case, hormone positive, ER positive breast cancer. And yet their uptake, even for relatively well-tolerated drugs, is extremely low. And one of the big problems, I think, with cancer prevention, when it is focused on pharmaceuticals, is that inevitably, because people get cancer over a long range of their lifetime, it means taking a drug for a long time. And even the best tolerated drugs always have toxicities, and many of them are chronic. Perhaps Andrew or Steve, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I can comment on this. So you're right, endocrine therapy, there have been studies showing that it reduces risk of breast cancer by about 50% in at-risk individuals. And you're right, it has been recommended as a treatment to reduce breast cancer risk. I think the reasons for the low uptake are multifactorial. I think there's been a lot of research on this, actually, more than I can summarize in a few seconds, but I think there are some physician-related aspects with regards to having that conversation with patients. I think there are also, issues related to taking a drug, as you say, with such as endocrine therapy, which does have side effects. I think one insight that you can find is that women who are at higher risk of cancer due to perhaps genetic predisposition or a prior diagnosis of DCIS or LCIS do appear to be more likely to take the medicine, suggesting that the higher your risk, the more likely you are to take a medicine for prevention. But I think you're right. I think if we had a better way of working out who to treat, who's at highest risk, and when they should take the medicine, and potentially schedule that medicine in a way that the exposure is reduced to a level that's sufficient to prevent cancer, but not bringing side effects, that would be the ideal world to be in. But, it's challenging. It's challenging. And I think Claire Turnbull has raised her hand. Maybe she has some relevant insight for that too, actually.
Claire?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical geneticist at the Marsden. So we see patients and families in whom the pattern of risk looks to have a genetic element. So they may have BRCA mutations, or they may have a strong family history. And certainly colleagues of mine worked in Jack Cusick's early prevention trials, and particularly the premenopausal women, actually taking tamoxifen is pretty miserable. And these are women who are well and do not have cancer. So as soon as you get any kind of side effect profile, the notion of taking a drug every day for a condition that you do not yet have, and are by no means at 100% likelihood of developing, represents a challenging value proposition. Even getting people to adhere to aspirin, I know from John Byrne and the CAP studies, these are Lynch families, and they've got, relatives who have died young of colorectal and endometrial cancer. Even adherence in that group was challenging for a cancer that doesn't have a sort of day-to-day side effect profile. And actually, I know John Byrne, one of the drums that he bangs is actually the GPs being very reluctant to prescribe aspirin, even in Lynch families, because of the risk of gastrointestinal bleeding. And even John sort of going around sort of touting, and actually the data are it's more risky having a colonoscopy than taking aspirin overall, the sort of statistical risk. But people, I think, you know, to the prescriber, giving a drug in a preventative setting, there's a sort of a particular focus on the side effect profile. So I guess, and those are two exemplars where we had the data around the preventative effect was gleaned by other studies. So the sort of suggestion around risk reduction aspirin, I think, came from the big cardiovascular trials. So you got that data free of charge. And likewise, the data around the tamoxifen and the SERMs and the anastrozole came from observation of reduced new primaries in the follow-up where it was being used in the adjuvant setting as endocrine therapy. How you go about embarking on trialing new drugs for prevention is highly challenging in terms of sort of breaking that cycle of incentivizing, you know, looking at the risk profile and so forth. So I always think sort of chemo prevention sounds like a great idea, but actually trialing it and implementing it. I know there've been rumblings of PARP inhibitor prevention trials in brachicarriers. And again, as a sort of initial notion, it sounds like a fantastic idea. You then get to the point of, you know, the cancers it purportedly might prevent are both amenable to risk-reducing surgery. And these are actually drugs which have a significant toxicity profile. So, you know, the notion of even initiating the trials seems, you know, far-fetched. Anyway, that was my kind of sort of experience around chemo prevention. I guess my question actually was looping back to Richard, that so, you know, I'm outside the, you know, the field around the incentives and distorting factors around drug development, but how do you change it? It seems the FDA needs to have higher standards around trial approval and drug approval, and that then directs the ecosystem to running the best research and the best trials and approving drugs that are effective. But how can that change be affected? So I guess that's a question for Richard or Jack.
Jack, you want to address that?
So I think I may be less sympathetic. So I think getting regulatory standards right is very difficult, right? And it's very hard to know until 50 years later whether you got them right or not, right? So, you know, one of the best histories of the drug industry is a great book by James LaFanu called The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine. And arguably the golden age of drug discovery occurred during a time when, you know, people could do things in R&D that would not simply not be approved by the FDA now, but would put them in jail, right? So you had this kind of fantastic age of sort of rapid innovation, huge social benefits from like 1945 to 1975, when people behaved in a way now that would be regarded as wholly outrageous. And there was no requirement from the FDA for any efficacy evidence until 1962, right? So, and before then, the view was that the drug regulators' business was to make sure things weren't unduly dangerous, and then it was up to physicians and professionals to decide what worked or not, right? So, you know, companies could take a view about how much evidence they should generate, and then prescribers would take a view on whether or not that was enough to use a compound. So I think my personal view is that actually clinical trials don't tell us very much about drugs, really, right? And actually, we kind of learn about what drugs do in the 30 or 40 years after their launch. And this is my personal view. So if the standards for launching drugs are too high, you just get less chemical diversity on which the real innovative process subsequently grinds. Right? That's my personal view. You know, so there is a real cost of making it too difficult to launch drugs. And also, in my view, the drugs that aren't very good, they don't get used as much as the drugs that are good, right? So it's true, there are lots of very expensive, not very effective cancer drugs, but actually the ones that sell a lot are the ones that are effective. You know, big sellers are the Keytrudas. They're not the ones that cost just as much and don't really work, although those things, of course, sell something, right? So again, I may not be representative of the panel. I think I'm a relative liberal when it comes to regulation, and accepting that the current situation does cause near-term problems.
Anybody else want to comment? I'd have some concerns about that. I mean, the fact, as Richard says, that we have a slew of drugs, about 60 to 70% of which have never been shown to improve survival or its quality, is, I think, a big worry. And it's not something that patients and indeed many practitioners are really able to dissect. And so they may not be used individually in the same quantity as pembrolizumab or nivolumab, but there's still a lot of bad drugs causing toxicity giving to patients. And I think both the FDA and EMA need to have tighter standards, would be my feeling. Samra, you're a medical oncologist. Do you agree or disagree?
Sorry, I was just reading. There are quite a lot of comments now in the chat.
I was going to read those in a second. You can do that if you wish.
Well, Peter commented on evidence-based medicine being a problem, complex, but more likely effective interventions, which have no potential profit associated with them, will not get studied. And then those with pills will have evidence, will rule the day. I mean, I'm not sure that I agree with that sentiment, especially being a melanoma oncologist and seeing, having treated patients with futile therapies 15, 20 years ago, and today having effective therapies. I think that's what's made the difference in survival of melanoma, both patients with advanced disease and patients that presented with earlier disease who were at a high risk of relapse. But that's not at the exclusion. I mean, the whole argument has been, we've been saying it's about a balancing. That's not at the exclusion of effective interventions which don't have profit associated with them. And that's linked to a question, I think, somewhere else in the chat about how we incentivize, I think, from Svetlana, industry and pharma to invest more in prevention. That's not a question I can answer easily.
Yeah, there have been, many of you may want to look at the chat. I won't read them all. I mean, Peter said we should focus more on environmental risk factors. And clearly there's less risk if you could change the way that people behave. But that ain't easy either, as you well know. Clearly, the anti-smoking campaign has been fairly successful, but has taken decades to move. And trying to get people to eat differently or eat less or not drink is not been very easy. Emma Richardson, is Emma? Do you put things in the chat? Would you, if you're still looking in, would you like to ask some of these points or address some of these points yourself? Maybe she's not any longer.
Me, Robertson. Do you
Robertson,
mean me?
oh, I do beg your pardon.
No, it's all right. I don't know. I mean, no, not really. I guess my last question to Jack is whether he thinks that there is any hope that the market might kind of find its own way out of some of these issues.
So I think there are some real problems. So I think the market does some things quite well, right? So, but if one thinks about classic things that are not done so well, right? Again, one could sort of contrast oncology R&D investment with, for example, antimicrobial R&D investment, right? You have incentive systems which really are not controlled by the private sector, but private sector investment has to take place within that environment. And so what you've seen is a sort of massive withdrawal of private sector capital from antimicrobials, right? And a sort of massive flow of private sector capital into oncology. Now, I think there's a second problem, which is once something becomes very lucrative, then it starts being defended very vigorously by the people who find it lucrative, right? So you get kind of locked in to certain systems, right? Now within oncology, I think there's a lot of a kind of weird kind of competition, right? There's effectively competition to create data. There's not price competition, but you have a huge amount of competition to create data. People are trying very hard to create good drugs. You know, there's a lot of complaint that the drugs aren't good enough. Well, it's not because people are trying to create bad drugs. You know, there's a huge amount of very intense competition to try and create the best drugs that people can. But cancer is difficult, so lots of the drugs are not, you know, it's not as good as people hope. But I do think that we sort of get stuck with certain incentive systems that then have consequences that are suboptimal and are difficult to change, right? And I think it's very difficult for the private sectors to sort of create the new incentive systems that would, you know, create more sort of socially useful R&D. There's a whole bunch of issues, you know, so the way sort of IP works creates a whole bunch of problems, right? So there's very little incentive, for example, to invest in new uses of off-patent drugs, although that often might be very, very useful. And there's lots of sort of problems around the environment, and I think it's difficult for the private sector to solve it. And I think the incentive problem has to be solved at the sort of policy level.
You know, if I look at sports leagues like the FA or the North American sports leagues, they have salary caps. They have some regulation of maximum funding. I think, isn't it a failure of government to come to grips with putting caps on these obscene prices that drugs are sold for, and that they've let the market get totally unrestricted? I mean, there are precedents in other areas for setting limits without completely preventing private incentive and private profit. Maybe that's naive.
Well, I mean, I think in most cases, I mean, I think you have to think, why do you have the weird pricing environment you have in the US? And it's partly because it's a very sort of weird. I mean, it's partly because the law says the insurers have to pay for these things no matter how expensive it is, right? That's not a normal market. In most markets, if things are too expensive, you cannot pay for them. Right? Now, I'm not trying to be a sort of free market purist here, right? But there is a specific law or a set of legislation that requires these things to be paid for, right? And again, I don't want to be a sort of free market purist here, but there are certain therapy areas where actually pricing in the US seems to work quite well, right? Although on average it's higher than Europe. You know, once therapy areas become reasonably competitive in the US, the market often does its job where you don't have things like mandatory coverage of every drug. You know, if you look at the diabetes market in the US, the prices of lots of branded diabetes drugs within relatively competitive classes are not a million miles from what they'd be in Europe, right, where you have sort of regulated prices. But it's very specific on the kind of dynamics of the sort of niche. And oncology is just very peculiar in that you have a combination of mandatory coverage and providers who make more money when they use more expensive things. That's what's created the sort of weirdness in oncology.
I agree. So we're coming up to 1:10. So I think we should bring this to a conclusion soon. But I'm willing to take, say, 2 more questions if any of the audience would like to raise their hand. Please.
Yeah. Hi there.
Lisa.
Thanks very much to speakers. Thanks, Ian. I just wondered also if maybe Richard Sullivan or some of the other panelists could comment about the workforce skill set. So, for example, if 80% of the curative or better outcomes are coming from modalities outside the drug arena, so whether it's radiotherapy or surgery or other sort of interventions, what about the up and coming new clinicians and healthcare workers that are entering the system? Have we got a deficit, for example, in surgical expertise and or radiotherapy expertise, given that those are actually making more of an impact than drugs? So is that also an incentivization sort of tsunami of concern that we've also got to face or worry about? And is there anything being done to sort of attract also in the areas where perhaps it's considered to be less lucrative, or where the skill set is already beginning to show sort of a dearth of expertise?
Richard?
So very quickly, I mean, we published with David this piece on the future of cancer care in the UK. We actually found no evidence of that. There's massive deficits in workforce in medical oncology, clinical oncology, surgery, etc. And it's been hard. I mean, someone might want to say this. I think it's been hard recruiting people into all those domains. Are you more likely to have a better academic career being a medical oncologist? I mean, we could have an interesting debate between the surgeons and the medical oncologists here. Maybe, yes, because there's greater funding, etc. But I genuinely think, I mean, there's a chicken and egg problem here about how you bolster, and we haven't talked about this, how you actually bolster research in unmet areas like surgery, radiotherapy, palliative care, because it isn't simply crowding out by biopharmaceutical research. There are other systemic issues that we haven't got time to go in today. But I mean, from my perspective, I've not seen any of that. I think we've just got workforce deficits across the board.
Yeah, I mean, the other nuance as well is that, for example, if you've got a tumour removed by surgery, you're not talking about having a drug for years or months. So the expense, looking back at the relative costs versus absolute costs. I mean, Richard, you've also talked about how radiotherapy as a sort of entity is highly expensive to put in sort of these, you know, costing millions, hundreds of millions of pounds. But then once that unit is in place, actually it can serve for many, 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 many years. So the sort of cost of the infrastructure versus, say, a drug sort of pipeline is also quite complicated to capture, and to look at the cost relative sort of, you know, appreciative values. Is that something else that is being done to sort of look at those areas?
We don't have up-to-date cost of illness studies looking across the board. All I can say is, again, if you look at the individual centre levels, the cost of treating patients is going up and up and up. And in some areas like hemato-oncology, that is staggering now, the amount of money that we're spending per patient. But this is complexity increase across the board. Our patients are older, they're less fit. We've got more interventions to give them. There's more imaging, there's more pathology. We're treating them for longer. And compared to 10 years ago, and someone might want to say on this, it is staggering when you look at what we're spending per patient just at GSTT now. But there are not formal studies of this. And I do question about the whole sustainability of the whole package of care costs going forward, because, you know, there is, you know, we're using more robots now, in some cases totally robots. We're using more advanced radiotherapy and imaging. All of those have higher prices and associated costs. So I think biopharmaceuticals is just one part of this whole package issue here. Samara, do you want to say anything?
Yes, yeah, no, I think we're moving closer to hemato-oncology in terms of the complexity and the intensity of approaches and the multidisciplinary approaches. But that's, I think, come about as a result of also having potentially curative treatments in the metastatic setting for solid cancers, which was unprecedented in the past. And I think that's why philosophically we've moved closer to hematologists who, you know, with bone marrow transplants and, you know, relatively limited cure rates, but, you know, it was a given that this is what patients would go through. And that's what we're seeing with the emergence of cell therapy now. I mean, I would still, for balance, say that, you know, some of these therapies are absolutely essential in terms of providing durable responses for patients with metastatic disease and preventing relapse, especially in cancer types where chemotherapy and radiation have not ever been effective. They really have been transformational. But we're going further and further in terms of the complexity and the cost of therapies, and we have very little knowledge of how to sequence and combine them. That's largely done empirically. So for an example, if you're using immune checkpoint blockade in the adjuvant setting and that patient subsequently relapses, the standard of care is to again give them immune checkpoint blockade, perhaps in some combination. But we have neither trial evidence, no preclinical evidence that this is the correct action. We don't have great alternatives for these patients unless there is a clinical trial that they can go into. So by default, we are going with more of the same. And this is really coming back to my earlier point about the great, a profound need to understand the therapy and to study the patients. And when it comes to geographical disparities, we've talked about workforce and access, but also the ability of patients to participate in these types of studies, translational studies, is very limited to cancer centers. And we're definitely not capitalizing on the fact that patients are receiving these treatments and there is an opportunity to learn a lot more for the benefit of future patients. Sorry, that was probably too elaborate, but
it's okay. So David, we're going to take, this is going to be the last question. So David Cahoon, would you like to ask your question? You're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Never learn. Yeah, I've got COVID actually. So,
oh dear.
There's been some chat about diet in the chat, and this seems to me probably quite misguided. If you take the latest numbers I've seen for processed meat, it might cause a 10% increase in your risk, whereas cigarettes is 20-fold. I mean, it's trivial, and it's certainly no reason to think that it's causal anyway. So I think the trouble is there's a huge industry behind nutrition, vast and very profitable.
Nutraceuticals, yes.
Nutraceuticals, God, what bollocks that is by and large.
I agree.
So, and some of them just brought up pollution, but again, and the thing that's best correlated with your health is your wealth, isn't it? And not many rich people live next to motorways. So pollution is not good, but it may not be a cure to the problem.
Pollution is bad. I think that's probably a good comment on which to finish, unless anybody has any other burning response. So I'd like to thank all the speakers. I thought it was a very good presentation, lots of different points raised. Thank you for coordinating and complementing one another. And thanks to Consilium for hosting this. So have a good day, everybody, and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks very much, folks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.